welcome to another video. Today we are not doing Titanic. Instead, I wanted to discuss the future projects that I might do on this channel. So, it will not escape the attention of most of you that we are pretty much finished with Titanic. I've got lots of figures here, which are being painted up as we speak, but that's pretty much the last of the modelling to be done, Titanic. So, we need to start thinking about some new projects. So, over the course of the video, I'm going to talk over a few of the different ideas I've had for future builds, but I would also invite people to pop any ideas that they have for future projects down in the comments section below. One thing just to head off before we kick off, I've had a lot of comments from people saying, would you consider building an Olympic? Would you consider building a Britannic? And the answer to that is yes, I would. But I've been building a model of the Titanic for about 3 years now, and I would quite like a little bit of a change from the Olympic class liners. So I won't be building an Olympic or a Britannic as my next build. I'm not going to write them off as a future project, but I want a bit of a change from Olympic class for the time being. So without any further ado, let's crack on.
So the first option is HMS Hood, or the Mighty Hood as she was known. HMS Hood was laid down in 1916 at the John Brown shipyard in Glasgow. She was a Admiral class battle cruiser, and in total 4 of these were originally planned, and Hood was the first to be started. Now unfortunately, very soon after Hood's construction began, the Battle of Jutland revealed fairly serious design flaws in the design of the armament on board this type of ship. And so Hood herself received pretty major redesigns to try as best as possible to address these issues. But the other 3 ships that had been planned for this class were simply scrapped, the Navy taking the decision that it would be better to start from a new plan that completely redressed these issues, rather than working with a plan that was known to be flawed. So Hood was launched in 1918 and started her service in 1920. For most of the intervening years between the war, she served as the flagship of the Royal Navy and went all over the world, and was a genuine symbol of British naval strength and supremacy, actually. And of course, very famously, Hood was catastrophically destroyed and sunk in 1941 during the Battle of the Denmark Strait, when she was hit by a shell from Bismarck, and she sank within 3 minutes. As you might imagine, this was a catastrophe for the Royal Navy, and it was also an absolute catastrophe for morale in the UK at the time, because Hood, as I say, was a genuine symbol of British naval strength, and to be destroyed so quickly was a genuine shock, and it really did affect morale in the UK. From my own point of view, I actually had a relative on board Hood who didn't survive the sinking. So it's always been a ship of interest to me, and I think she's a very good-looking battle cruiser, and I think would be a very interesting model to make. I probably wouldn't make this into an RC model. It would be a sort of a shelved model. And my thinking behind that is because Hood was notoriously known as a wet ship. She always sat very low in the water, and particularly if you look at the stern section, she's very, very low in the water. So I think, although entirely possible to make into an RC model, not something that I perhaps want to. I think I'd want to focus more on getting the detail right, and not having to worry about things like waterproofing and stuff like that. But there's a number of things that we could do with her. I'm always quite keen on models, even if they are shelved models, having, operating propellers, operating rudders. With things like battleships, it's also possible to have a few other complications, so to speak, things like turrets being able to move and that sort of thing. Now, Trumpeter, the same company that made the Titanic model that I'm currently working on, also does a model of Hood in 1/200 scale, and I think they also do a slightly smaller model in 1/350 scale as well. So this is an absolute option for me, and I think this would be a really good build, and something that would probably take about as long as Titanic. It would probably be a good 2-3 year build. So this would be an interesting project, and something that I'm certainly quite interested in. Now, another option is the Golf-class Soviet ballistic missile submarine. Now, there's a number of reasons why I'm quite interested in these. Firstly, I think they're a really interesting shape. And what I mean by that is, to me, these subs, perhaps better than any other sub I know of, sort of show the design evolution of the submarine over the course of the 20th century. Because to me, this sub still has elements of the sort of the U-boat about it. You know, it still has design elements of a submarine that was designed to live on the surface and to submerge to get out of danger. But it also has design elements of the more modern style of submarine that was designed to live beneath the surface, and only really to come up to the surface on rare occasions. So I think, in terms of sort of design evolution of a submarine, this is a very, very interesting type of sub. However, there was one particular Gulf-class submarine called the K129 that had a particularly interesting history. The K129 sank mysteriously in 1968. And to my knowledge, nobody really knows what happened. She sank in the Pacific Ocean, and the Americans sort of noticed a really large amount of Soviet activity in the ocean. You know, ships combing back and forth, planes flying back and forth, submarines trailing back and forth, and the Americans pretty much concluded this is a reaction that is pretty consistent with the loss of a submarine. That's what we think has happened. And the Americans had a series of sonar antenna systems positioned at strategic points along their coastline and also along the European coastline as well. And by using these, they were able to triangulate an acoustic event, which they later concluded was the sinking of the K129. And they were able to pinpoint the location at which the submarine sank. And 6 years after she sank, in 1974, the Americans partially salvaged this submarine from about 3 miles down at the bottom of the Pacific Ocean. They were able to actually salvage part of this submarine and bring it to the surface in a highly specialised ship called the Hughes Glomar Explorer. Now, I'm not going to go into too much detail on this because it's a long, long story, but the project name for this was Project Azorian, and if you haven't read about it and you're interested in this sort of thing, I would absolutely recommend having a read. At the very least, look at the Wikipedia article for it, because it is a proper Cold War spy kind of story. It's absolutely fascinating. It's phenomenally interesting. Now, in terms of the modelling of this, this would of course be a radio-controlled submarine that I would make. I am aware of a place in the US that sells a fiberglass shell for this particular type of sub. So the modelling would consist of my cleaning up the fiberglass shell, adding detail to it, painting, yada yada yada, and then there'd also be all of the engineering within. So, you know, you'd have, for want of a better word, a pressure hull within the submarine with all of the electronics, servos, ballast tanks, all these kind of things to allow for the sub to operate as a submarine. So there's another video on my channel with me explaining the workings of a submarine that I already own, but I've always wanted to make a slightly more complicated sub with a slightly more sophisticated dive system, and this would be a great opportunity to do that. So this is another option. Now, the next ship that I would dearly love to make is not the Lusitania. This is actually the Mauritania, her sister ship. There were 2 ships in the class, one Lusitania that was built up in Glasgow, and Mauritania that was built on the Tyne. Now, this may be an unpopular statement, going off the fact that all of my previous material on this channel has related to Titanic, but Mauritania is my favourite ocean liner. And this stems from the fact that, in quite a few ways, I do actually think Mauritania was a slightly more technically advanced ship than the Olympic-class liners. She had watertight subdivision, just like the Olympic-class liners, but they used significantly more modern propulsion systems. Both Lusitania and Mauritania used 4 Parsons steam turbines, and each had 4 propellers. Now, of course, the Olympic-class liners had a steam turbine as well, but they also used reciprocating engines. So Mauritania and Lusitania were, arguably pretty far ahead of their time. Mauritania was laid down in 1904, and she was launched in 1906 and has sailed on her maiden voyage in 1907. So she was around 5 years before Titanic came around, and arguably had more modern technology fitted out aboard her. So why am I interested in Mauritania? Well, she was built where I'm from. She was built in Newcastle. And if, for those of you who don't know, Newcastle has a long and very proud heritage of shipbuilding. The river in Newcastle is called the Tyne. And at one time in history, all the way along the banks of the Tyne, there were shipyards everywhere. It was a bit like mining and other industrial practices. It was the absolute lifeblood of the city. And of course, like with many places in the UK, Glasgow, Belfast, Liverpool, so on and so on, shipbuilding is all but gone now. But nonetheless, she's still a symbol of sort of pride in the city, really. And I mean, incidentally, this is a photo I took from one of the cathedrals in Newcastle, where there's a piece of stained glass showing Mauritania. So purely because I'm from the city she was built in, I've always had an interest in this ship. And it would be a real privilege to be able to build a model of her. Now, unfortunately, for the time being, I suspect that this will remain a bit of a pipe dream, because as far as I'm aware, and please correct me if you know otherwise, but as far as I'm aware, I do not know of any reasonably large-scale models of Mauritania which are currently available. So there's plenty of really quite tiddly models, but I'm not aware of anything sort of, bigger than a couple of feet, which is really what I'm after. Which is a bit of a shame, because at the moment I would not say my skills are really up to scratch building hulls or anything like that. So until this model becomes a reality, this might have to be a bit of a pipe dream. But if you know any different, do please let me know. And incidentally, if anyone who builds models or who works for model building companies watches this channel, yeah, I would love to see a model of Mauritania on the shelves. Now, for a complete change of pace, for those of you who have seen the James Bond film The Spy Who Loved Me, in that film, James Bond has a Lotus Esprit, which is later revealed to also act as a submarine. And since I have dabbled with models, I've always wanted to try to build a model Lotus Esprit that is capable of driving around, but is also capable of driving underwater. Now, in comparison to the projects I've done on this channel before, my Akula submarine, my Titanic, this is perhaps not quite as serious a model, and certainly there's not as much scope for fine modelling. But there is huge scope for this sort of model engineering. And for those of you that have watched my videos right from the start, you'll know that that is one of the areas that I really, really enjoy. I love the sort of the problem solving of trying to fit a lot of function into a very, very small space. And if you think about it, with a model like this, there would be a sizable amount of problem solving to do. We would need essentially a radio control car that can work underwater. So we need a radio control car that also has a propulsion system that works in the water, propellers or something like that. A radio control car that can steer on land, but can also operate rudders underwater. Ideally, I'd also like this to be able to submerge, so we'd need something that is capable of either making itself heavier or pulling itself under the water with the use of dive planes. So there's quite a lot of sort of fairly tricky mechanical stuff going on inside this. And there's also quite a lot of sort of fairly complicated electronics, because of course, if I made this, I would want to be able to change the mode, so to speak. I'd want it to have a dry mode, a land mode, where traction power goes to the wheels, steering signals go to the front tyres. But then I'd also want an aquatic mode, an amphibious mode, where tractive effort went to the propellers, steering signals go to the rudders, and so on and so on. So a reasonable amount of complexity in here. And it would be a lovely opportunity for me to crack out the 3D printer and really give that a test as well. Is it possible? I don't know. Probably. I think it's probably doable. but whether it is absolutely possible or not, I'm not sure. But this would be a really, really interesting project, although admittedly perhaps slightly less serious than other things that I've done on the channel in the past. Now, the next idea I'm thinking of is not a particularly famous ship at all. In fact, even ship might not quite be the word here. Boat might be more accurate. But this boat is called Sula II. And for pretty much my entire life, I went on her once a year to go sightseeing of the Bass Rock off the coast of North Berwick up in Scotland. So sentimental value is very high on this one. She's a wooden clinker-built boat, and I think if I were to make this model, I'd make a sort of probably about a foot-long model. It would have to be scratch-built because, of course, there aren't any kits for this sort of thing, but I think I could probably manage. And the attraction, perhaps, of building something like this is it would give me the opportunity to build a planked model. Not for the first time, but it would be the first time on this channel. And, of course, that would be quite interesting and quite a change of pace from what I've done previously on Titanic, which was polystyrene, I think. I think I would also make this a shelf model. I wouldn't probably put any motors or anything in this because I think it would be a bit too tricky to sort of hide all that electronics in what is a pretty much just a sort of wooden lifeboat, really. But I think this would be an interesting build. The challenge here would really be getting any sort of plans because I've already reached out to the older owners, but they've now sold this boat and don't have any plans. And I'm not entirely sure where I could go to get plans for it. I've got plenty of photos of it, so it might be a case that I'd be able to sort of trace out the shape of the hull just by looking at photos. But ultimately that would probably be an approximation more than anything. But this presents perhaps a very, very different kind of model to any of the ones that I've already talked about in this video and any of the ones that I've done in the past on this channel. So that's another option. Now, another idea is HMS Belfast. Now, the reasons for this are twofold. Firstly, she's a very interesting ship and she had a very interesting service career. But secondly, I have every possible resource for the building of a model such as this at my disposal because HMS Belfast is moored on the Thames in London and I live in London. So if I wanted to make a model of her as she was when retired, I really could not wish for a better, more factually accurate resource because the physical ship is literally about 7 miles from where I am right now. Now, Trumpeter make a 1:350 scale model of Belfast, and I probably wouldn't make this radio controlled. This would probably be a shelved model again, just because of space constraints, I think. But nonetheless, this would again be quite an interesting build, quite a challenging paint job because of the sort of dazzle camouflage. And I believe there are plenty of add-on kits to go along with this as well. So there we go. That is a selection of ideas that I might or might not build in the future. The last thing I would just say is that if you, the viewers, have any other ideas on things that I could build, do please give me a shout, let me know. You know, I've gone through all of the sort of usual manufacturers of models and had to think about models that would be significant to me, models that would be of interest to me, and I've sort of come up with a list based on that. But if you have any other ideas of things that you think I might be interested in, do please, you know, give me a shout and let me know. I'm always interested in what other people say, and I'm also very well aware that other people may well be more aware of models that are sort of coming out in the near future and stuff like that. So yeah, as I say, give me a shout if you can think of anything else, and also let me know what you think of the ideas that I have sent across today. So that's the end of this video, quick one. Next time I will be back with Titanic and we'll be looking to get things pretty much finished off on that model. So, without any further ado, I will see you later. Bye for now.